Would you force your daughter to undress in the bathroom with boys who are also undressing? If your daughter was reported she felt uncomfortable in a boy's presence in a bathroom or locker room, would that be considered by your administration discrimination or bigotry? Would you allow your daughter to physically fight and get beat up by a boy who called himself a girl? Yes or no?
Yesterday, the Secretary of Education, Mr. Cardona, he was testifying before the Committee on Education. And the purpose of this testimony was to sort of flesh out the new rules with regard to Title IX provisions. This, of course, is supposed to protect women's rights in school from discrimination. And the Biden administration and Secretary Cardona, he's rewritten those regulations to basically include the definition of a woman being a man who is now identifying as a woman. And of course, we know the can of worms that opens. Not only will people's free speech be violated if they use the wrong pronoun against somebody, but also women's privacy will be violated. Their security will be put at risk because they will no longer be able to be in a ladies' room with just exclusively ladies or a women's locker room, not to mention the competitive disadvantage that they'll have when they play sports against, well, what can only be described as a biological man. So Congressman Burgess Owens of Utah, he had some sharp questions for the Secretary of Education in this regard. By the way, it should be pointed out that Burgess Owens is a college athlete of his own right, including a Super Bowl champion with the Oakland Raiders, football player. So he knows about college sports and about the inequity of what the Biden administration is about to do. Take a look at this blistering line of questioning and note specifically how the Secretary of Education tries to weasel out of saying anything.
Mr. Secretary, you're in a very unique position to impact the lives, futures, and fortunes of millions of female athletes. Americans on both sides of this debate need to know how deep your commitment is. Would you force your daughter to undress in the bathroom with boys who are also undressing?
I am not going to be commenting on athletics rules that we haven't proposed.
You can't say yes or no on that?
I'd be happy to talk about a Title IX.
If your daughter was reported she felt uncomfortable in a boy's presence in a bathroom or locker room, would that be considered by your administration discrimination or bigotry?
As an educator for over 25 years.
You can't say yes or no to that?
I'd love to respond to your question, sir.
Okay, so yes or no. Would it be considered discrimination? She did not want that to happen.
As an educator for over 25 years, we have had the
responsibility. Okay, all right. I don't have but a few minutes here. Girls have now entered in contact sports of boxing and wrestling. Would you allow your daughter to physically fight and get beat up by a boy who called himself a girl? Yes or no?
Be happy to, once we finalize our regulations on Title IX athletics, to come back and have a conversation with you.
Let me just read this real quick. There's a Cherokee proverb that says, "A man's highest calling is to protect women, so she is free to walk the earth unharmed." I'll say this, Mr. Secretary, before I go on to this next topic. With all due respect, I pray that our country will never, ever have the vision that your policies are now driving us toward in terms of manhood. It's a vision that teaches our boys that harming girls is no big deal. I pray that we remain a country that produces overwhelmingly mass majorities of men who feel the way I do about my girls. I will give my life in a heartbeat for my girls. And the blessings I have is they have no doubts about that. There are millions of men and women across this country that do not have faith, do not have trust in you protecting our girls because of policies you can't say yes or no to. By the way, those are not very hard questions as a father. It's either yes or no, and you could not answer that. Okay.
That's right. I love Burgess Owens and his dignity and plain speak that he brings to the table. My favorite congressmen are the ones who don't talk like congressmen. And Burgess Owens is one of them. Now, a couple of things to unpack here. This was a 5-minute questioning. I just showed you a couple of minutes of it, but throughout much of it, the Secretary of Education kept saying the same thing. You heard a little bit of it there. We're still in the process of working out the final rules when it comes to athletics and athletic facilities, so I don't want to comment on it. He's a weasel. Everybody in the Biden administration are trying to weasel out of this because they know the political impact of it. They're trying to thread this needle where they get it done to please their radical, well-funded base who are trying to push these transgender issues down the throats of the American people who don't want to have anything to do with them. Yet at the same time, do it in such a way that doesn't alienate, normies like us who would never vote for such a thing. And at the same time, try to sort of pivot and call you and me and Burgess Owens hateful bigots for daring to say that, young girls should be able to undress in private without a fully intact male right next to them. So every time the Secretary of Education tried this weasel move to say, well, I can't really comment on this because we're still in the process of working out the rules as it goes to athletics, that's just a lie. He can 100% comment on this. In fact, the rule process that the Department of Education is going through right now, that's not some sort of secret private process. I mean, I'm sure they'd love it to be, but this is a public process. Everybody can comment on it. You can comment on it. I can comment on it. In fact, they even open up to public comment. If you go to the Department of Education, they actually have a portal welcoming public comment. So everybody else is allowed to publicly comment on it, but the actual man who is driving the agenda for these rules isn't allowed to? Bull. Of course he can comment. And in fact, if it wasn't a politically volatile issue, he'd be commenting up and down the wazoo. If he were the director of the EPA and they were doing a public comment session for rules pertaining to greenhouse gases, he and Buttigieg would be up there thumping our chest. Here's what we plan to do. Now, we're going to go through the process of working out these rules, but when all is said and done, this is what we're going to do to save the planet. And they'd be doing this with their, thank God we're here, because the planet would be destroyed if we weren't keeping you from using a gas stove. That's exactly what they'd be doing. So when he says he can't comment publicly about the rules process, it's just an out and out lie. And he's delivering that lie to try to weasel out of the reality. But see, now Burgess Owens, he's a smart man. And he didn't ask the question about the rules. I mean, he started to. But then when he got the weasel words, he decided, you know what, let me ask you another question. If your daughter complained about a man undressing in the locker room right next to her at school, would she be guilty of discrimination? Now, that's a really simple question. It doesn't have anything to do with the Department of Education. It doesn't have anything to do with the law. It has nothing to do with the federal government, state government, or local government. It has to do with what kind of father you are. And more importantly, what kind of rights our daughters should have. Now, Secretary Cardona, he didn't want to answer that question either. And of course, we all know why. Because if your daughter does in fact complain about having to undress in front of a fully intact biological man, or having to endure the indignity of seeing a fully intact biological man disrobe in front of her, right next to her in the locker room, if she complains about that, if Secretary Cardona and the Biden administration and all of the money that props this sorry excuse for a White House up, if they have their way, and boy, oh boy, they're about to have their way with Title IX, in fact, your daughter would be guilty of discrimination. The school could reprimand her or punish her. Or if the school doesn't do anything and tries to protect her, that biological male who forced that disgusting indignity onto your daughter, that young man's family can now sue the school system for discrimination. And therefore, that's why the school will, in fact, protect him and not protect our daughters. And God bless Burgess Owens for laying it out there exactly how it needs to be. Sadly, this did not get the attention, again, that it should have yesterday across all of cable news. That's why we deliberately are bringing it to you. The reason it didn't get attention yesterday is because a porn star was testifying in Manhattan. And boy, that's That's what we all have to focus on, right? That's the most important story we've got. And just to bring it home here, so that you can vividly understand exactly what Joe Biden, his Secretary of Education, his Attorney General, and his political party, the Democrats, want your daughters to endure. Here's Riley Gaines on Sage Steele's podcast describing vividly exactly what it was like for her the first time she had to endure this with the swimmer now known as Leah Thomas.
When you first saw him up close and in person for the first time?
Well, first I had to do this because he's so tall.
He's huge.
He's huge. Wikipedia says he's 6'1", but understand Wikipedia is lying to you. He is 6'4". So I mean, this Goliath of a man. His feet are huge. Of course, wearing a women's swimsuit with a bulge. Like, there was so much about this where I was just like, oh my gosh.
So what
We
was your
couldn't
reaction when you
help-
saw him in person for the first time?
It
In
was
a
ki-
swimsuit.
We were kind of like, me and my teammates, actually the first time I saw him was in the locker room. And so, as I said, which let me just kind of set the scene, a swimming locker room is not a place of modesty. So it's a very intimate, not modest environment. And there's also a lot of course, fully undressing.
Of course.
So I'm in the locker room. I have my back turned, of course, undressing. I believe I was going from my practice suit back into my street clothes. And all of a sudden you hear a man's voice in that locker room. Of course, it's awkward. It's embarrassing. It's uncomfortable. It was innate for every single girl in that locker room to like cover themselves, whether it was with their hands or their clothes or their towels, and to leave as quickly as they could. But of course, it's an utter violation. It felt like betrayal. It was traumatizing. And maybe not even necessarily traumatizing because of what we were forced to see or how we were forcibly and non-consensually exploited. It was traumatic for me to know just how easy it was for those people who created these policies to totally dismiss our rights to privacy without even a second thought, without even bare minimum forewarning us. And so he kind of just went off and he was in the wide open and just takes his clothes off, and lo and behold, Thomas and all of his glory or lack thereof. So that's what the experience was like.
That's the world that the Democrats want to foist upon your daughters. That indignity that was just described, and Riley Gaines is a woman of great dignity and courage and focus. But here's the thing. I don't know. I know it's old-fashioned, and I know that we're called bigots, and I know that we're called culture warriors, and this is all a fake story for the Christian right that's trying to scare and demonize and, whatever. I don't care. I'm past that at this point. Here's the old-fashioned notion that I have as not just a father of two daughters, but also just as a mature man in our society. I think maybe the first time a young woman sees a naked man, it should be a time of her choosing, with her consent, something that she is prepared for in every possible way. Maybe when she's 14 years old and she's going to her freshman high school gym class for the first time and having to undress, it shouldn't be in front of a man. And she shouldn't actually see male sexual organs at that time in her life. I know that's it's unpopular. I know that I sound like a real Neanderthal conservatives there, but last I checked, I think it would be okay to raise your daughter in such a way where she doesn't see a naked man right next to her until, I don't know, maybe even her wedding night. That's shocking, isn't it? The Biden administration and his party, the Democrats, they want you, if you think that way, you think the way I think, they want you to suffer criminal repercussions. That's what's at stake here. And I'm glad Riley Gaines just laid it out there as clear as possible.